bit about what Americans United for Separation of Church and State is. Its name is its mission. It is not against religion. It is for the separation of church and state and for the free exercise thereof. So that's really all we need to say. Our speaker tonight is Katherine Stewart, author of The Good News Club, and she is an investigative journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Reuters, and Newsweek International. She has also published 2 novels. She now lives in New York City with her family. So please join me in giving a hand to Katherine.
It's a pleasure to be here. I know there are a lot of educators in the audience, teachers, former teachers, and superintendents, other people involved in different aspects of education. And what I want to talk about is, I think, of utmost importance not only to parents and educators, but also really the future of our country as a modern secular democracy. So I want to talk about a range of initiatives by the religious right to infiltrate and undermine public education in America. I want to talk about where they come from, who's behind them, what their aims are with respect to public schools, and why we're facing this situation, this sort of religious encroachment into public education now. Although these religious programs aim at all age groups, a surprising number are directed at very young children in their first years of schooling. In my research, I was surprised to see over and over again that one of the reasons that they don't attract the attention that they should is that they rely on deceit. Simply put, many of these so-called Bible study clubs and other programs that are designed for the public schools have an agenda far more sweeping and potentially threatening to public education than they let on. And the biggest factor driving this insertion of religion into public schools is judicial activism from the right. Now, I know these are bold claims, and some people will say they're alarmist, but I've learned firsthand that they aren't. I first became alerted to this situation about 4 years ago when my daughter, who was a kindergartner at the time, was attending a public school in Santa Barbara, California, and an after-school group called the Good News Club showed up on the roster of after-school activities. The program described itself as Bible study from a non-denominational standpoint. And my first thought was, hey, I love Good News. What could be wrong with this? The group required parental permission to join. I figured let the parents who want their kids to learn about the Bible sign them up. Now, I support teaching about the Bible in public schools from a non-sectarian standpoint, as literature, history, or anthropology. And I'm also a strong supporter of free speech. But then I started hearing stories from parents around town whose kids attended schools where Good News Clubs had recently been established. And I began to hear about how kids attending the clubs were targeting other kids at school for what I can only describe as faith-based bullying. Let me tell you the story about a 6-year-old that I know. Zoe was the daughter of a family friend. She was on the playground when her 6-year-old classmate, Ashley, went up to her and said, "You don't believe in Jesus, so you're going to go to hell." Well, Zoe said, "That's not true." And things got a little heated, and the teacher overheard the exchange. We decided to use this as a teachable moment. Children from different religions and families from different religions, she explained, have different perspectives on different issues. Now, Zoe was fine with this, the little girl who had been told she was going to go to hell. She's like, okay. Well, actually, the little girl attending the Good News Club, she was devastated. How can that be? She started crying. I know it must be true because they taught it in school, and they don't teach things in school that aren't true. How can they lie to us in school? And this story gets to the heart of the trouble with Good News Clubs. I don't have a problem with kids talking about their religion at school with their friends, but I do have a problem with Ashley believing that her particular religious beliefs are sanctioned by and have the support of her public school. And that perception on Ashley's part was no accident. It soon became clear to me that the real purpose of the clubs is not to reach the kids who are enrolled from the very beginning. As I explained in my book, most of the kids who are enrolled from the beginning in these Good News Clubs belong to families who are already members of churches that are ideologically aligned with the Good News Club and their sponsoring organization, the Child Evangelism Fellowship. And they have a sort of partnership situation, which is how they get into the schools. The real purpose of the club is to use those kids to try to recruit their peers. At every Good News Club training I attended, children were given points or prizes for recruiting their peers to the club, sometimes even candy. Now, here's another thing. When the Good News Club came to our public school, a number of concerned parents met with the leaders of the Good News Club. Actually, those parents were evangelical themselves. There's a spectrum in the evangelical world, as we all know. There are differences of opinions on these issues. So this is a program that not all evangelicals approve of. Several evangelical families in our school met with the Good News Club leaders and said, we know you mean well, you're just not right for our school. Could we offer you free and better space in this beautiful evangelical church, literally next door to our school, maybe 40 feet away. And the space was free, it was better. It was at the same time. The Good News Club leaders declined, saying that the school was where they wanted to be. They know very well that young kids cannot distinguish between an activity that takes place in a school and that is one that is sponsored by the school. They made a point, as other Good News Clubs do, of showing up before the bell rings, trailing balloons, laying out huge spreads of candy and treats and cupcakes in places where children are sure to see them. I've got 5 and 10-year-old, they'll do anything for a cupcake. And they believe in the tooth fairy, so I discovered another layer of deceit in their program. They make an effort to present themselves as being broadly Christian, with non-threatening labels like non-denominational or interdenominational. But in fact, the activists I met who work for Good News Clubs believe that most Americans who call themselves Christians really aren't, including U.S. Episcopalians, United Methodists, Roman Catholics, which they describe as a whole other religion. They say we're Christians and they're Catholics. Don't even talk about the Unitarians and Quakers, forget about the Mormons. And of course they categorically reject the legitimacy of all other faiths. Buddhists, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, non-believers, all these are merely the harvest who need to be converted in their public schools if they are children. Here's another layer of deception. They claim to offer Bible study, but the Good News Clubs I attended had very little to do with studying the Bible and everything to do with religious indoctrination. It was no accident that Ashley decided to proselytize on the playground. It was the main thing that the Good News Club, or what she thought was the school, taught her to do. So who's behind these Good News Clubs? I decided to investigate. I spent 3 years traveling the country, talking with their leadership, and attending Good News Clubs in different parts of the country. I joined a mission project in Boston, and I attended their national convention in Talladega, Alabama. What did I find out? The CEF has a very specific and deeply fundamentalist agenda. At their national conventions, they are represented by extremists, keynote speakers who rail against the so-called homosexual agenda, whatever that might be, support creationism, think public education without Jesus at its foundation is a consequence of evil. And one keynote speaker says that interfaith marriage, which he referred to as interracial marriage, is to be condemned. So I'm here to tell you that the impending arrival of Good News Club in our community was not good news at all. Neighbors argued bitterly. Some were attacked for their faith and ethnicity. A father from a country torn apart by religious wars wrote poignant letters to the principal, expressing his shock and dismay that the same kind of thing could be happening here in America. Several families decided to pull their kids out of the public schools and send them to private schools instead. And large numbers of families suffered in silence, but cut back on their PTA volunteer work, or cut back on volunteering for the science work, or cut back on their donations to the school. you can see in our community that the arrival of the Good News Club actually was a net loss for our public school. It made large numbers of families feel somehow disenfranchised from the school. Many parents started feeling like the school was perhaps not as welcoming a place as they had thought it was. And I saw this dynamic repeated over and over in other parts of the country. I describe it in detail in my book, The Good News Club. How the arrival of the Good News Club tears communities apart, previously harmonious communities, where, as one father said, we used to all be, Loyal Heights parents together. Now it's walk into the school and it's you're a Christian, you're the wrong kind of Christian, you're a Jew, you're a Buddhist, you're an atheist. Sort of fractures community, in many cases along faith lines, in some cases along political lines. So anyway, I was surprised to learn that there are over 3,200 Good News Clubs in public elementary schools around the country. Their presence has grown in public schools 728% in just 10 years. When I started this project, there were 4 of these clubs in Santa Barbara public schools. Today there are 11. If they continue to grow at this rate, they will reach their goal of placing a Good News Club in every public elementary school in America within just 2 decades. So I soon learned that religious initiatives in public schools are not just limited to Good News Clubs, and they're not just limited to regions of the country known for their religious conservatism. I want to tell you a story about another one. A year and a half ago, my husband and I moved to New York City and enrolled our children in a public school across the street from our home. One Sunday, just after school began, I looked out my kitchen window and I saw a group of people gathered in front of the schoolhouse door. They had a tray of lollipops, a 4-foot-tall neon sign, and some religious literature. And it turned out they were part of an evangelical ministry, and that our school was in fact their church. So I decided to attend the service at the church at our school. I was sitting there in the library, and the pastor was directing the group. He said, "Notice the names of the children on pieces of paper." I looked around and I saw the posters my kids and their schoolmates had made with pictures of themselves, first and last names, sometimes birth dates, pictures of family and pets. "Pray for them," the pastor said. "Pray that the families of this school will come to know Jesus and say, 'This is a house of God.'" So after the service, I figured, wow, the school must be getting a lot of money from this church that's actually praying over the pictures of the kids. This seems pretty intense. They must really get a lot of money to allow the group to do this kind of thing. So I said to the pastor, "How much rent do you pay?" He said, "Oh no, we don't pay rent. New York is way too expensive. We just pay a custodian's fee." I found out that the church was using the school 4 times a week, and they did not pay for, up to 4 times a week, they did not pay for heat, air conditioning, electricity. They didn't pay their furniture. They didn't pay for the wear and tear on the furniture. They didn't help renovate the bathrooms, which the PTA did at a cost of $100,000. And they had no lease, and they were paying 0 rent. Ours was just one of over 100 New York City public schools that have doubled as rent-free houses of worship. The vast majority of them evangelical Christian churches, not all of them, but except maybe a small handful of exceptions. Thanks to a 2001 Supreme Court decision that I'm going to talk more about in a moment, the church were able to plant themselves in the public schools, bypassing pre-existing laws that barred partisan political groups as well as worship services from the public schools. So I attended services at dozens of these churches. In public school classrooms, I learned about creationism. I was taught that the people and dinosaurs walked the earth together. At a public school in Greenwich Village, I heard the pastor praise the anti-gay ministry, an Exodus-affiliated ministry that is run out of the church that was planted at that school. From my seat in my own public school library, I was instructed to pray that America's government would be overtaken by Christian control. All of this happened at New York City taxpayer-funded public schools. In many instances, the churches in question, including in our church, in our school church, was not sort of the work of local community members. It was the work of an international church planning organization that realized they could use a state subsidy to open up a branch office. in each neighborhood's best piece of real estate, the public schools. That's where the kids are. That was our tax dollars at work. So what happened? Separation of church and state. And why is this happening now? It's the direct result of a 2001 Supreme Court decision that called Good News Club versus Milford Central School, in which the United States Supreme Court appeared to suggest that keeping religious groups out of the schools was a violation of their free speech rights. The court held that religion is nothing more than speech from a certain point of view, and therefore these religious activities are protected by the free speech clause of the First Amendment. So, is religion just speech? Our founding fathers didn't think so, and that's why they inserted two separate clauses into the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause and the Free Speech Clause, that treat religion as something other than speech. They knew that both religion and government flourish best when they steer clear of each other. Our tax code recognizes that religion is more than just speech, too, because religious organizations have significant tax advantages. And our legal code recognizes that religion is more than just speech because religions don't have to adhere to the same anti-discrimination laws that other groups do. But in this particular instance, the Supreme Court argued that religion is just speech, and therefore to exclude religious activities from the schools is to violate their free speech rights. So back in New York, a long legal battle culminated in a Second Circuit Court of Appeals decision that affirmed the Department of Education's right to exclude the houses of worship, along with partisan political groups. But the religious right, in what has increasingly become a refrain of persecution, whenever they are stymied in their efforts to promote their agenda, have cried, persecution, and they are trying to do a runaround on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. They've introduced legislation to try to change that decision, and a vote is expected in June. So we'll see what happens there. Many of the churches are still occupying the schools. Anyway, in the course of researching my book, I discovered many other religious initiatives in the public schools. Right now, enormous resources are being devoted to something called peer evangelism, and that is getting kids to try to evangelize their peers in public schools. Now again, I support the right of kids to talk about their religion with their friends at school, but many of these peer evangelism efforts I've personally witnessed can't really be defined as student-led. For instance, last fall, I went to an annual prayer event that takes place on public school campuses called See You at the Pole. Now, students gather around the pole every year, usually the third Friday of the start of the school year, third Friday of September, and they pray as ostentatiously as possible, often with sound systems and things like that. At the See You at the Pole I attended, pastors had organized the events on behalf of the youth groups. They ordered materials from See You at the Pole's national offices near Fort Worth, Texas. They made videos telling their kids to attend. They lent the kids sound equipment so the students could amplify their efforts. And they held an after party at a local megachurch. The students were bussed in, obviously by adults from different parts of town. And the after party was staffed by adults wearing See You at the Pole t-shirts. So to call this a student-led activity is sort of like a soccer club, like a toddler soccer group, where the kids are actually kicking the ball, but there are coaches sort of standing around telling them what to do. So it's really pushing the envelope on how to define student-led speech. The idea that it's okay as long as the kids are doing it is now still pervasive among those who view the public schools as what they call mission fields, that is, places for kids to do the missionary work of converting their lost friends. That religious advocacy groups are publishing books with titles like Reclaim Your School, 10 Steps to Practically and Legally Evangelize Your Public School. They're also publishing the Alliance Defense Fund, which was one of the largest legal advocacy groups of the religious right, is publishing booklets and posters telling kids, how how to insert their religion into the public school day, and actually directing parents to tell their kids how to do it. The ideas include using talent shows as opportunities for kids to sing religious songs, or even using school assignments as opportunities to witness to their teacher, being very sectarian in the way they spread their holiday greetings, their Christmas greetings, and organizing on-campus revival rallies at the school. As long as it's student-led, it's okay, they keep telling the kids. Here's another example. The Lifebook Movement is a project of the Gideons International. Now, we all know the Gideons. They've placed a Bible in every hotel room across the country. You know, these Bibles are intended for adults. We can do with them as we choose. They've been trying to distribute Bibles into public school campuses for years with very limited success, because it's really illegal for adults to spread proselytizing literature, religious literature on campus. But they've hit the jackpot with the peer evangelism exception. They've written a little, I wish I had a copy, it's this really cute square shape. It looks like an iPod case or something. It's like white and square. It looks really cool, and it's an evangelical gospel written specifically with teens in mind. Has real teen handwriting scrawled in the margins, and they get kids to distribute this little booklet to other kids at school. Using kids to do what grown-ups are not allowed to do is called a God-given loophole, in the words of a Lifebook Movement leader. They say it brilliantly threads a separation of church and state loophole. And you want to know how successful this group has been? In just 2.5 years, they've distributed almost 3 million of these little books on public school campuses around the country. At other events that I've done, teachers come and give me all kinds of religious literature, life books and other types of religious literature that shows up in their classrooms, because kids are spreading them to other kids. I heard from a Kansas mother who was telling me that her youth group, organized by their church, has been placing religious literature on her son's desk every single morning, because they know that he's not Christian. And every day he just throws it away, and the next day they do the same thing. So finally she went to the youth group leader, who was the leader of all these boys, who was doing this, and said, we'd really appreciate if you stop, with this faith-based, sharing. This religious sharing is starting to look like faith-based bludgeoning. We'd really like you to stop putting religious literature on my son's desk. And his response was, we don't care about you, lady. We want your kid. We're not going to stop. So student athletics also provides the religious right with opportunities for peer evangelism in the schools. The largest of the programs is the Fellowship for Christian Athletes. The Fellowship for Christian Athletes instructs children on how to pray before, during, and after their school sports activities. They seek to present an open face of toleration, thereby drawing in Christians of a variety of persuasions. But their support is hardline evangelical. And in the last 20 years, they've gone from involving 100,000 kids in their programs to reaching 1.8 million kids. Now, I frankly don't have a problem if a bunch of Christian athletes or Jewish athletes, Muslim athletes, whatever, want to get together after school and perform acts of worship and talk about their faith. But the problem is when a lot of these groups instruct kids to make their prayers part of the regular school sports activities during the school day, thus forcing everyone on the team to take a stand. And as you can imagine, for non-religious members or members of minority faiths, this creates an atmosphere of faith-based intimidation. Well, Fellowship for Christian Athletes claims to use athletic fields to develop character. But of course, membership in such groups is technically optional. Kids are not required to join. But other groups come to the public schools to teach character and use it as a way to get into the schools where every kid is forced to participate. Here in Erie, Pennsylvania, Jim was telling me that a group called the Power Team would come in. It's one of the many groups that does this. The Power Team, the Strength Team, they come into the schools with a program on self-esteem or drunk driving or anti-bullying, and they aim to leave with a collection of young religious converts. I attended a talk in another part of Pennsylvania, closer to Philadelphia, and a woman was telling me that at her son's school, a group called Amnion came into the school with a program of relationship education. And this all sounded fine and good until her son came home and said that the instructor had told the class that married women should not use birth control without the support, without the affirmation of their husbands. So a program that was ostensibly about developing healthy relationships really had a religious overlay of values and judgments, but because the program itself was stripped of mentions of God or Jesus, it was deemed to be secular and thus paid for by the tax dollars of that community. In my own public school, a Kabbalah Center program showed up as an after-school program, in-school program of character education that my daughter was mandated to attend. When enough parents were made aware of the fact that this program, which was called Success for Kids, was in fact a program that was sponsored by the Kabbalah Center, there was enough outcry that the school quietly dropped the program. But really, it's minority faiths that are unable to have any traction in the public schools. When the programs are sponsored by perceived majority religions or majority religions, often it's very difficult to get them out because a lot of people actually support the presence of the program. So what do all these initiatives have in common? They have strong backing and support from the legal advocacy groups of the religious right, like the Alliance Defense Fund, Liberty Council, the ACLJ, the Pacific Justice Institute. You may never have heard of these groups, but they have combined budgets of over $100 million per year. These legal groups are determined to turn America into a Christian nation and as defined by them, and they have public schools in their sites. They have a very broad range of initiatives. They're very involved in the anti-bullying initiatives, which are efforts to stymie anti-bullying programs. They've gone so far as to support faith-based exceptions in certain states, sort of legislative actions that have happened in states like Michigan and Tennessee, where children are not allowed to bully unless it's out of a, quote, sincerely held religious or moral belief. So you can't bully a child unless you say, because God says so, and then you can do it. So this does bring me to one of the main points I want to bring to your attention. Judicial activism from the right. That pivotal moment was the 2001 Supreme Court decision, Good News Club versus Milford Central School. In that decision, the court pushed free speech so far that the Establishment Clause, which prohibits government funding or endorsing a religion, has been eviscerated. They've used the distinction between school-sponsored speech and student speech as a loophole. And now programs like the Good News Clubs are turning our public schools into mission fields. In conclusion, there isn't much doubt that the separation of church and state is being undermined here. All these religious initiatives, aggressively pursued, will chip away at the credibility and the standing of the public education system. It's an illustration of why the separation of church and state is not always just a matter of protecting individual rights. Separation of church and state is not a luxury of our system of government. It is the foundation of it. Sometimes our preoccupation with individual rights, I think, blinds us to the nature of the problems that we face. We suppose, for legal purposes, that a school building is just a building when it's not. We suppose that an education is just another transaction when it is much more than that. We suppose that religion is just speech when our history has shown that religion is a distinct activity that has special advantages and also safeguards that keep religion free from government interference and vice versa. and that our society flourishes best and our government institutions, such as the public school system, flourish best when that principle is respected. And we may well find in a future world where the rich have their schools and the religious have theirs and the poor don't get educated at all and everyone is schooled in contempt for those who are different, that we've kept our rights but lost everything but the pretense of democracy. Thank you very much.
Have any other groups emerged in response? And part of the solution is having morally courageous people like you address it. But how have you been received by these schools? And what can we do beyond just talking about it? How can we push back?
Well, the question is, what is to be done? That's an interesting question. I think that we can't begin to face our challenges unless people are aware of what's happening. When the group Goodness Club came to my daughter's public elementary school, I went online and there was nothing. I mean, there was absolutely nothing. Well, now there is something. You know, people starting to learn about Good News Clubs, and they're starting to learn about religious encroachment in their public schools. Parents who are upset about religious encroachment are starting to get a little more active, contacting, groups like Americans United and some of the other groups that are with an interest in preserving church-state separation. And I think it's very important to support those organizations. I think it's also important if you're a parent to sort of prepare yourself for the kind of faith-based bullying that erupts on public school campuses when religious initiatives are inserted in those public schools. And I think it's important to be politically active, to bring better people to the judiciary, by supporting politicians who will do that. And I think the most important part, of course, is to learn what's happening in your own public schools and to educate others about this movement in our midst.
When you were telling us that the schools, everybody would separate because of this thing, it was very interesting that some would pull people apart like that. And I mean, something that's supposed to bring people together, and it's separating apart.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a great point. I think that, it would be nice to believe that the harm to the community is an unintended byproduct of what they do. But the more research I did into this movement to infiltrate and undermine public schools, the more I realized that it is precisely the point. The harm to the public schools is precisely the point. Now, I want to quote from some of the leaders of the religious right. In 1979, Jerry Falwell made the agenda clear. He said, "I hope to see the day when, as in the early days of our country, we don't have public schools. The churches will have taken them over again, and Christians will be running them." Then Robert Filburn, a member of the Council for National Policy, which is a very influential group, sort of continued with this message. He said, "I imagine every Christian would agree we need to remove humanism from the public schools. There's only one way to accomplish this, to abolish the public schools." And he urged Christians to run for school boards whenever possible. When I say Christians, I mean as he defined Christians, saying that your goal, once on the board, must be to sink the ship. Meaning, once you get on the board of the public school, destroy it. And then D. James Kennedy, founder of the highly influential Coral Ridge Ministries, now called Truth in Action, said pretty much the same thing. The modern public education system was begun in an effort to deliver children from the Christian religion. It's interesting. I think many people fail to recognize the extent to which a certain segment of the evangelical community has never really accepted public education as a legitimate enterprise to begin with. They think that the public schools as secular institutions are evil because they fail to promote their particular form of the faith. And therefore, this harm to the public schools and the public school community is actually it's an intended byproduct. Now, you can see a lot of support for the voucher movement coming from much of the same sector. People use the word choice to promote vouchers. I know that the voucher thing is huge here in Pennsylvania. People say parental choice. We all love the word choice. I want to have lots of choices when I go to the supermarket. But in fact, what vouchers do is they take money from the public school systems and funnel it to private religious schools. In many instances, those religious schools that are now funded with public money are shown to use textbooks from Bob Jones University and Abeka. So it amounts to a state funding of an establishment of religion. I believe this is a violation of the Establishment Clause.
My question is, have you given any thought when we collectively say we want evolution taught, we want school taught secularly, separate from religion, they say we're pushing our religion on them. They claim that, we collectively have this secular religion. How do you answer that question?
Secularism is religion like not collecting stamps is a hobby. When we're talking about science, the thing about beliefs is that there is a lot of scientific evidence. You can go through the scientific process and document things like evolution. Beliefs require faith. Things like the evolution is something that's documented by evidence. So, they will call secularism a religion, but in fact it's not. Secular public schools neither promote nor disfavor any particular form of belief. There is such a thing as scientific process. It's interesting, they talk about the strengths and weaknesses. They try and sort of wiggle around this whole thing about, the strengths and weaknesses of the theory of evolution. But nobody's asking us to, consider the strengths and weaknesses of the theory of thermodynamics or these other measurable scientific principles. So really what it is an effort to undermine the teaching of scientific principles and to undermine the, looking at the record.
Are you aware of any discrimination in favor of religious organizations like Good News Clubs versus secular, or even maybe there were any atheistic organizations that might be trying to do similar things? To what extent are these going on? Are these things going on during school hours? I know you mentioned like kind of a dress down sex education class, that they had, but I guess it seems to me that if you have after-school classes, or after-school events, it's hard to go and say, well, we're going to forbid this religious institution from coming in and having one, and we're going to allow this one. You seem to want to make a legal distinction between different kinds of speech, and I'm uncomfortable with that. I wonder if you would expound upon the kind of legal distinction you'd like to see. Thank you.
Thanks. We used to exclude religion from public schools because the understanding is that if you allow a religious group to come into a public school and preach its religious doctrines, that amounts to a state support of that establishment of religion. I have a piece today in The Guardian. I think it illustrates one of the problems that happens when you actually allow religious groups to come into the public schools. It talks about how the Good News Club this fall is planning to teach an Old Testament story called The Slaughter of the Amalekites, in which God told Saul to kill all of the Amalekites. They were evil because they were non-believers, and Saul failed to kill every single one. He saved the king and also some of the better-looking animals. And God was very angry with Saul for not committing a slaughter. In the Old Testament, in all of the translations specify, many of the translations, the women, the children, the men, and the animals. And the babies. They actually mentioned the babies. So the Good News Club is now going to teach the story of the Amalekites and the lesson. If you go through, I have all their books. They go through this. The problem is not that Saul was asked to commit genocide. The problem is that Saul did not obey God to the letter because he saved some of the animals and he saved the king. And really, he should have prayed to God for strength and been able to obey God. He didn't obey God because he didn't kill them all. The problem with letting religion into the public schools, as you mentioned, is you then can't start deciding what aspect of the religion is appropriate for the public schools. Is it appropriate for our public schools to be teaching, for children to be learning in their public schools we're talking K through 6, that obedience to God means that you actually complete the genocide and kill them all. Once you let a religion in, you really can't, decide the government can't parse through its teachings and decide which of them are appropriate for public schools and which aren't. And I think that this situation that we're coming up with the Good News Club, illustrates perfectly one of the reasons why we need to keep religions out of the public schools.
I'm concerned about the apparent degradation of K through 12 education generally in the entire United States. Where you've heard some of the public service announcements, we're like 27th among the nations now in math and science. And I'm very concerned. I'm the product of parochial grade school, and there were some good elements to it, but I thought there were a lot more bad elements to it, particularly when I got through school myself, as well as putting my son and daughter through public school. And so I'm really concerned about the funding of schools, but also I think one of the deeper problems is the erosion of family household support for their children in school, and the teachers, as well as teachers being adequately trained and educated to provide quality education. And then the real capstone of the whole problem is these thing called vouchers, where the religious schools want to bleed what life there is in the public schools out of the public schools and take the mobile, better educated kids and bring them into the religious schools. And so I don't know if you can comment on that, but there's a nationwide problem with the degradation of education. An awful lot of it starts with the collapse of home support for most of the students coming into the school system. And that's a very difficult problem to deal with, because you have to deal with the privacy of the home life. But again, getting parents to take responsibility, along with fending off this voucher onslaught to bleed even more life out of our public school system.
Thanks so much for sharing. This is a little bit out of the purview of my book, but I've sent my kids to 2 public schools, one in California, one in New York. They were excellent public schools, incredibly involved parents. Guess why? They were in affluent areas. I think a lot of the problems with public schools reflect a problem with economics in general in this country. But that's not really what my book is about. But I've been very happy with our public schools. We're lucky. We can afford to live in a well-funded area.
I'd like to point out, you made the comment that the parents need to stand tall. We need to make our children stand tall. I am a devout pagan. I have been for long since my daughter was born. My daughter went to a school district not here in Erie, but for her grade school was in another part of this state. And she came home one day and she said, I go to school with some really stupid people, Mom. And this was 4th grade, part of why we moved from there. And I went, what do you mean? And she said, one of the kids in class tried to tell me that you don't love me because you don't take me to church to teach me about Jesus. And I was like, wow. The kids need to be told. I think that's the first line of battle to me, is if my daughter can look at someone who's trying to indoctrinate her and go, nope, that's the first line of defense. We need to teach the kids.
Thanks for sharing. It's an important point.
What is your impression of this issue as an electability issue for school board, or potential school board candidates? When they run on this idea of keeping church and state separate, is it potentially successful as an issue?
That's an interesting question. Would this be an electability issue? I think in an area, frankly, like the area I write about in Seattle, the first chapter of my book, I write about how a majority of parents in that community really did not support the arrival of a Good News Club. Might be an electability issue in an area like that, but that's because it's a very progressive area. What I find with a lot of church-state issues is that most parents, frankly, don't want to speak up and just want to kind of, it's a very contentious issue. Kids, education, religion. It's like something that gets everybody upset. So I'm just not sure about that, but it's an interesting question.
I was just reading New York Times about ALEC, and I don't know, I know it stands for
American Legislative Exchange Council, yeah.
But then coming into Pennsylvania for writing legislation here, They're writing it in Wisconsin. Now, they want to do something that seems very charitable, helping disabled children. And that was just recent in the magazine. And then it said, well, you know, what they really want to do is, like you mentioned earlier, something else to bleed the schools dry.
Right.
What I'm saying is, if they want to kill the public school system, what happens to some of the kids who can't afford to go to private schools? What if their plan for that? I mean, do they have some kind of a scheme of
Does
some?
ALEC have a contingency plan? Absolutely not. ALEC has an agenda. It's a very pro-business agenda. They've actually been very involved in a number of different legislative, actions. No, okay, sure. They have been providing some of the model legislation to undermine not only the teaching of evolution, but also the teaching of climate science. Climate science is like my nuclear, like somehow I mispronounce that word every time I say it, the term every time I say it. But they've introduced model legislation to undermine the teaching of climate science along with evolution to states like Tennessee and many others. They've also provided some model legislation about model voucher legislation, and also they provided model legislation for some of the anti-bullying efforts. Again, in Tennessee, there was a piece of model legislation that kind of legislation that would undermine, efforts to prohibit anti-bullying. So they are involved in various aspects of. I'm pretty sure about that anti-bullying, but I know that they've been involved in various aspects of educational policy. And no, they don't have a contingency plan for poor children.
Thank you.
We've talked about public schools and parochial schools and charter schools. But one of the things that really gets stuck in my throat and my heart are homeschooling. And have you done any research into the curriculum that is circulating for homeschools? Because when the words agape come up, or some of these other religious names to those curriculums, it worries me so much.
There's a writer named, we're talking about homeschooling, there's a writer named Katherine Joyce. She's written a stellar book about homeschooling. She's written a lot about it in her book called Quiverful, and it's about a movement within a certain segment of the evangelical world to have lots of children as their sort of to fill your quiver with arrows for God. And homeschooling is big in that movement, and she writes a lot about the curriculum and sort of methods of homeschooling, justification for homeschooling.
This is such a murky issue because who doesn't want to have good programs to help children develop, and there seems to be such a need for that as well. So it's kind of hard to identify which groups are the bad groups and which groups might be the good groups. But referring to the issue of the Supreme Court decision that allows them to legally use the schools, what are the legal requirements for the school districts in terms of allowing people to use them? I mean, do they have some leeway in terms of charging rent or excluding everybody because of liability issues? Or what are their abilities to do something with that?
Whenever what are the requirements for schools vis-a-vis the outside groups? Whenever the schools open what is technically called a limited public forum, that is to say, whenever they let in an outside group of any kind, a soccer group, an art group, they must let in, because of that 2001 Supreme Court decision, they must let in a religious group. But what this in effect has done is give a trump card to religious groups, because now schools may exclude for any reason a dance group or a painting group or a martial arts group, as our school did in Santa Barbara, for any number of reasons. Oh, it's not right for our kids. We don't want kids learning how to fight on campus. We think it's going to create too much of a mess. But the one activity, one category of group they may not exclude is the religious group. And it's only, no other group, no other religious group is doing this on anywhere near the scale that the Good News Clubs and other fundamentalist Christian groups are. So in effect, what's happening is that many schools now have, a bunch of after-school sports activities and art groups and theater, etc., and then a group that promotes fundamentalist indoctrination. in kids. It's not like all of a sudden all the other religions are doing it too. It's interesting because when I started this project, I was like, geez, wow, the evangelicals are doing this, sort of far right, so are any other groups doing it? And I found myself on the phone with the American Jewish Congress, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, various different Muslim groups, Catholic groups, to try and figure out, do any other groups do it? I think I called the US Episcopalian, head of that group. No other groups are doing this on anywhere near the scale. Maybe one or two groups, non-theists don't do it. There aren't any pagan groups meeting after school, going after church kids. I can't imagine that if there was, that group would be allowed to last a very long time. And actually, what's pardon?
How do we organize for that?
You tell me.
Seriously.
But it was really interesting.
Ready for us, why don't we use it?
I do want to say that when minority groups try to exercise their rights in the same way that the perceived majority groups do, they're shut down, if not by law, then by convention. For instance, there's a pagan woman named Ginger Salazar, I believe, in West Virginia, who tried to distribute Wiccan literature in public school because she saw that they were distributing some Christian literature, some maybe Bibles. And she went to the school and the principal said, absolutely not, you may not do this. And she said, oh yes, I will. And she got a letter from Americans United. And he was so freaked out that they shut down the religious distribution of all groups. Which brings me, and that kind of thing's happened again. Camp Quest did the same thing. They tried to distribute, flyers for this atheist summer camp, just as people were distributing Vacation Bible Camp literature, and the whole after-school thing was shut down, and all the distribution of religious literature. And I've come across many parents and educators who work at schools where the after-school form has been shut down altogether. There are no after-school activities in the public schools. Now that, to me, is sad. Yes, that is one way of excluding the religious groups, by shutting down the limited public forum. You can take out the soccer and take out the art and take out all that great stuff, and then you can also take out the religious group. But the problem with that is that schools are more than just bricks and mortar. Schools are community centers. They're where we all set aside our differences in our religion, our background, whatever, to come together in support of our children and their future. And after-school activities are where kids meet and they run their first races and they make their first pot. I mean, I think there's a huge value in after-school activities. So whenever I see a school that has shut down the limited public forum and excluded all after-school activities, you know that there's a terrible conflict behind that decision, and a lot of pain felt by a lot of families, and a lot of loss felt by a lot of kids.
I heard that the voucher system was disproportionately used for religious instruction because the average cost of religious schools is somewhere in $6,000 to $7,000, and the average private school is so much higher that they say, yeah, let's have the voucher program. Are there a lot of states doing that?
The voucher movement is a huge push right now by the religious right, and frankly by the Republican Party. I think every single Republican candidate talked about school choice. Mitt Romney has come out in support of vouchers. And there just is a huge support for that. The cost of religious schools, of course, is less because religion gets significant tax benefits. Yet another reason why religion is not just speech like any other organization. Other organizations have to pay taxes and they have to abide by certain non-discrimination laws. But religious groups do not.
I'm a product of a school where we prayed before school and read the Bible. We had a Bible reading and prayer. And then I was graduated when Madeline Murray hit the scene, and there was shockwaves across the country with Madeline Murray. And they did away with baccalaureate, which was another shocking thing. And I remember we had one Jewish girl that we were all aware of was Jewish in the school. And this was something I just took for granted as part of my life. And then little by little, I started, other information started coming into my life, And over the years, I've listened to James Dobson, James Kennedy, these different Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, and I've seen this collective movement towards a concerted effort towards stacking the school boards with evangelical religious right people, and now watching the Republican Party being taken over by the religious right evangelical people. And have you noticed in your travels that it's not just the school-age children, but the school boards, and we even have a township supervisor that is pushing this evangelical idea into the process in working?
Thank you for your question. I think there's a huge focus on children and schools at every level. And in my book, I write about something I was astonished to come across called the 414 window. You know, the world of mission, sort of like every other business, there are people at the very top who think about strategy. Where are we going as a culture? Where are we going as an organization? Where can we do better? How can we increase our effectiveness, achieve better market penetration? And I wrote about something called the 414 window that I discovered when I went to a festival for missionaries, where in 2009 there was a new direction announced at the highest level of mission strategy, which is children between the ages of 4 and 14. There are actually charts and graphs to show that this is the age group when kids are most likely to establish their religious identity. I don't know if any of you can see that, but see, this is like, you know, between 0 and 4, nobody sort of converts, and between 4 and 14, they sort of use this chart and supporting materials to show that if you put your effort into children between the ages of 4 and 14, as Matt Staver, head of Liberty Council, said, he calls children strategic machinery. This is at the National Convention of the Child Evangelism Fellowship. He said, if you want to change the direction of the cruise ship, of the whole culture, where are you going to put your efforts? He said, you know, those children, ages, he said 5 to 12, he said that is the most strategic age group that we have. And that is why we're seeing the explosion of focus on public schools in every aspect of public schools. So anyway, I want to thank you guys so much. Thank you so much to Jim Wise, and thank you so much to Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And I'm really so appreciative of your support. Thank you.
I must say one cautionary word here. A certain political party was mentioned twice here tonight, and Americans United does not take any political role.